The lock was a Medeco, biometric, reinforced, the kind they installed in federal courthouses and pharmaceutical vaults. Linden clocked it in the 3 seconds before the door swung shut and the deadbolt engaged with a sound like a rifle round chambering. She stood in the center of the room and breathed. The private study of Asher Thane was, by any measure, the most dangerous room on the compound. 3 walls of floor-to-ceiling shelving held binders coded by color, year, and freight route. A custom hardwood desk anchored the far wall beneath a single arched window overlooking the gorge, the river below running white and fast between walls of Douglas fir 300 feet down. The encrypted terminal was powered off. The secondary server rack hummed quietly behind a locked cabinet in the corner, and the filing system, the filing system, was an absolute wreck. Invoices cross-stacked with routing manifests, ledger printouts rubber-banded to customs declarations from 4 different countries. Linden looked at the mess. Then she took off her blazer, folded it over the back of the desk chair, and started reorganizing. She had been sent here 6 days ago by Mercer and Caldwell Consulting to conduct a third-party financial audit of Thane Logistics, Inc., a Pacific Northwest freight conglomerate with 9 operating subsidiaries and reportedly clean books. She had suspected on day 2 that the books were not clean. She had confirmed it quietly without telling anyone. On day 6, this morning, she had been sorting through Q3 Port Authority invoices when the windows blew in. She didn't know what the rival faction was called. She didn't need to. She knew the sound of organized violence, the specific crack of a vehicle ramming a gate, the difference between warning fire and intention. She had grown up in a neighborhood where those sounds punctuated summer nights the way thunder punctuated storms. She had dropped to the floor behind the credenza before the first glass settled. Thane had found her there, not cowering, doing a mental inventory of the documents within arm's reach that could be used as evidence. He had not been impressed. He had pulled her up by the arm, dragged her down a stairwell that smelled of concrete and gun oil, and put her in the back of an armored vehicle without a single word of explanation. 3 hours north, deep into the Cascades, he had brought her here, his primary compound hidden on a ridge above the Skycomish River, and locked her in his study. "Until I know what you are," he'd said, his voice flat and cold as poured concrete. He hadn't looked at her when he said it. He'd looked at the wall. Then the lock engaged. That had been 42 hours ago. Linden had spent the first hour finishing the reorganization of his physical files. The second hour she'd used to map the room, exits. 1 door, 1 window both impassable, sightlines from the exterior, and communication options, none, her phone confiscated, the terminal biometric locked, the satellite receiver hardwired into a system she couldn't access without tools she didn't have. Then she had started reading. Not the sensitive operational files. She read the freight invoices, the Port Authority receipts, the customs documentation she'd already partially reviewed before the attack. Because here was the thing Thane didn't know, the thing she'd been turning over in her mind for 42 hours in this beautiful locked room with its river view and its very good wool rug. Someone inside his organization was bleeding him dry, slowly, methodically, in the specific way that only someone with intimate knowledge of his routing schedules and a second set of books could manage. She had seen it in the Q2 numbers. She was now surrounded by 3 months of additional documentation, pulled from the properly organized shelves, absolutely certain of it. She was also, if she was being honest with herself, the only person in this compound who knew. Thane came on the evening of the 3rd day. Linden heard the footsteps before the lock disengaged. Heavy, uneven rhythm, the left foot landing slightly harder than the right. She had noticed that about him in the downtown office. An old injury. She filed it away the way she filed everything, automatically, without deciding to. The door opened. He filled the frame in the way that men like him tended to, not performatively, just as a fact of physics. He was still in the same kind of suit, charcoal with no tie, the collar button undone. The shadows under his eyes had deepened into something structural. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 90 hours and was running on controlled fury and black coffee. He looked at the filing system she'd reorganized. The muscles in his jaw moved. "Sit down," Linden said, turning back to the ledger open on the desk in front of her. "You look like you're about to fall over, and I need to ask you something." A long silence from the doorway. "You're locked in my study," Thane said slowly, as if passing the words for a translation error, "against your will." "I'm aware. The Medeco is a nice touch." She capped her pen. "Did you know your Q2 freight variance is running at 14%? You reported 9 to your partners. The 5-point gap is being siphoned through a shell account running under a subsidiary in Reno that doesn't exist in your physical documentation, but appears in 3 separate wire transfer confirmations I found in that bottom drawer." She pointed to the far filing cabinet. "You have a thief, a careful one, someone who understands your routing well enough to hide it in the noise." The silence this time was different, heavier. Thane walked into the room. He didn't sit. He stopped in front of the desk and looked down at the spread of documents she'd laid out. The invoices, the wire records, the handwritten routing notes cross-referenced by date. "You were sent here to find this," he said. "I was sent here by Mercer and Caldwell to conduct a clean audit. I found this because I'm good at my job and your filing system was a disaster." She met his eyes. "Cold gray, the color of overcast sky over water. Who handles your Reno side logistics?" "Lyle Garrett." "How long?" 4 years. She nodded, something settling in her chest with a click she recognized as a puzzle piece landing correctly. "The discrepancy starts exactly 51 months ago. 3 months after he would have been fully integrated into the routing system. He knew when to start because he knew when no one would notice the baseline shift." Thane pulled a chair from beside the shelving, turned it backward, and sat. He rested his forearms on the chair back and looked at the documents. He didn't speak for 2 full minutes. "What do you want?" he finally said. Linden looked at him. The question was direct. She appreciated direct. "I want my phone back and I want to go home, but since neither of those appears to be on the table yet, I want access to the terminal and the secondary server, so I can pull the full wire transfer history and build you an airtight paper trail. If you're planning to deal with Garrett, you'll want documentation. Otherwise, it's your word against his, in front of people who might find it convenient to believe him." Something moved through Thane's expression that wasn't quite surprise. It was the look of a man recalibrating. "You're not afraid of me," he said. "I grew up on Meridian Street in Spokane," Linden said. "I've been afraid of men who were actually trying to hurt me. You're trying to contain a variable. That's different." She picked up the pen. "Terminal access, Mr. Thane, and preferably before whoever's funding Garrett's secondary income figures out that the attack on your downtown office didn't go the way they planned." He gave her the access codes that night. He also brought her a sweater, which she hadn't asked for, but had been cold enough to need, and set it on the edge of the desk without comment before pulling a chair across from her. They worked for 4 hours. Linden combed through 18 months of wire transfer records, cross-referencing routing timestamps against the physical manifests she'd reorganized. Thane sat across from her, authorizing the encrypted file requests she needed, answering her questions about subsidiary structures in monosyllables. Around midnight, she found the full extent of it. "It's not just Garrett," she said quietly, turning the laptop to face him. He looked at the screen. He didn't move for a long time. "That's Reza's account," Thane said. His voice came out flat and very controlled, the way water sounded just before it went over a dam. "You're head of security. For 8 years. Linden watched his face. She had seen that look before, not often, but she recognized it. The specific devastation of discovering that the person you trusted to guard your back was the one who'd been selling the coordinates of it. She thought of her own history briefly, the boss at her first accounting job who'd presented her analysis under his own name, the committee that had quietly misplaced her scholarship application, and she put that history away, because this was not the moment for it. They needed someone on the inside of the security rotation, she said. Garrett had the financial architecture. Reiser gave them the operational windows. The attack on the downtown office wasn't random. They were looking for something specific. She pulled up the flagged file. This server archive. There's a record here showing a remote access attempt the morning of the attack. They were trying to pull the offshore account records before they burned the location. Thane closed his eyes, just for a second, just long enough for the exhaustion to show through the crack in the armor. Then he stood up. I'll handle it. Not tonight, Linden said. He stopped. She didn't raise her voice. She just said it the way she said everything. Plainly, with the calm of someone who has already done the math. You haven't slept in 4 days. You're running a fever you haven't acknowledged. If you walk out of this room and try to deal with Reiser tonight, you will make a mistake. Tired men make confirmation bias errors. They see what they expect to see and miss the variable that kills them. Silence. Get some sleep, she said, turning back to the screen. I'll have the full documentation prepared by morning, a complete forensic trail, dates, accounts, transfer amounts, access logs, everything you need. He was still for a long moment in the doorway. You could put that documentation somewhere and use it as leverage, he said, against me. Linden looked up. I could. I haven't. She held his gaze. Go to sleep, Mr. Thane. He left. The lock didn't engage. She wasn't sure if it was an oversight or a choice. She sat in the lamplight for a long time after his footsteps receded, her hands resting flat on the desk, looking at the unlocked door. Then she turned back to the terminal and kept working. He didn't handle it cleanly. She knew it before she heard anything, the specific quality of the compound's silence 2 nights later, a wrong kind of quiet that pressed against the windows. Then at 2:40 in the morning, the door to the study opened without the lock being touched. Thane was standing in the frame, not wearing a jacket. His white dress shirt was soaked through on the left side, dark and wet in a way that had nothing to do with rain. He looked at her across the room. Something in his face was trying to arrange itself into control and failing. Then his knee buckled and he went down against the doorframe. Linden was across the room before he finished hitting the floor. She dropped to her knees on the hardwood, her hands finding the source of the bleeding by pressure and instinct. A gunshot wound along his left flank, high on the ribs, the fabric torn open and the skin beneath it an ugly, deep mess. Reiser, she said. He didn't go alone. Thane's voice was a rough rasp. His head was back against the doorframe, his color wrong. I missed the third one. Where's your medical kit? Cabinet under the bathroom sink. Code is 4721. She went. She found it, a full trauma kit, military grade, which told her something about the man and the life he'd built for himself. She carried it back and knelt beside him. The wound was serious, but not fatal if she was fast and didn't shake. She had always been precise under pressure. Numbers didn't panic. Evidence didn't panic. She decided she wouldn't either. Hold still, she said, opening the iodine. Linden. I know it's going to hurt. Hold still anyway. She poured the antiseptic. Thane's breath came out through clenched teeth, his right hand shooting out and gripping her wrist with a force she'd feel in the morning. She didn't pull away. She let him hold on, the way she'd learned to let people use what they needed when they had nothing else to grip. Is Orson clean? She asked while she prepared the suture kit. A beat, yes. Tell me the passcode for the satellite phone. I'll call him. She threaded the needle. Look at me. Don't look at the needle. His grey eyes found hers and stayed there. She pushed the curved needle through his skin. His grip on her wrist tightened to the edge of pain, but his gaze didn't waver. She worked in silence, stitch by stitch, the rain picking up against the window that faced the gorge, and something about the steadiness required, the absolute necessity of keeping her hands still, keeping her voice calm, keeping him anchored to her eyes, made the rest of the world very small and very far away. Why did you come here? She asked quietly, tying off the third knot. You have a compound full of men. He was quiet for long enough. that she thought he wouldn't answer. "It's the only room I know is clean," he said finally. His voice had lost the controlled register entirely. What was left was just a man, exhausted past the point of performance. "And you were in it." She cut the thread. She pressed gauze firmly over the stitches and taped it with more care than strictly necessary. Then she picked up the satellite phone and made the call. Orson, a gravel-voiced man who sounded like he'd been woken from a dead sleep and was already moving, took her instructions without argument after the first 30 seconds. Once it became clear she was the only person currently holding his employer's ribcage together, and therefore the most relevant voice on the line. She told him to approach from the river trail. She told him which gate code to use, and why the main road was compromised. She told him what to bring and who not to bring. She told him Thane was secure. When she ended the call, she helped Thane to his feet, bearing more of his weight than she expected. His whole left side effectively useless, and got him to the reading chair. She covered him with the blanket from the shelf. She brought water. She sat back down at the desk and opened the terminal. The study door was still open. The compound beyond it was dark and quiet, and for the next 7 minutes entirely unguarded. She looked at the open doorway for a long time. She thought about Meridian Street, about 10 years of working twice as hard to get half as far. About the precise and practiced way the world had looked at women who came from nothing, and expected them to quietly disappear back into it. She thought about the filing cabinet she'd reorganized, the terminal she'd unlocked, the 17 months of forensic documentation she had built in this room, in this chair, under this lamp, without anyone asking her to, and without anyone knowing she'd done it. She got up. She walked to the door. She closed it. She engaged the lock from the inside. When she turned around, Thane was watching her from the chair. His expression was something she hadn't seen on his face before. Not calculation, not assessment. Something rawer than either. Something that looked, underneath all the armor and the exhaustion and the dried blood, almost like wonder. "Get some sleep," she said, walking back to the desk. "I have to finish the access log documentation before Orson arrives." He watched her sit down. He watched her open the files. He didn't say anything else. But she noticed, in the peripheral way she noticed everything, that he didn't close his eyes until she'd turned the desk lamp to its lowest setting. Orson arrived at first light with 6 men, and the controlled, efficient fury of someone who had been lied to by people he trusted and had very specific feelings about it. By then Linden had locked down the compound's security grid, identified the 2 cameras Riser had looped, and drafted a 4-page forensic summary that she printed and placed in a manila folder on the edge of the desk. Thane was pale and moving carefully but conscious and tracking in the reading chair. When Orson came through the door, compact, iron-faced, radiating the energy of a controlled detonation, he stopped at the sight of Linden standing between him and Thane with a folder in her hands and the particular expression of a woman who has already decided how the next 10 minutes will go. "You'll want to read this first," she said, holding the folder out. Orson looked past her at Thane. Thane gave a single nod. Orson read. His face, already hard, went harder. When he reached the 3rd page, his jaw tightened in a way that probably meant something definitive for Lyle Garrett's immediate future. "Garrett is in the Reno facility," Linden said. "Razor is somewhere on the east side of the grounds. The looped camera coverage is heaviest over the east outbuilding. I'd start there. Secure both before they know last night failed." She paused. "And when you bring Garrett in, I'll need 10 minutes with him, before your version of a conversation." Orson looked at her steadily. "You're the accountant." "Forensic accountant. Accountants track money. I find where people hid it and what it cost them to do it." She met his eyes without blinking. "Garrett has a family. A real one. If he believes I've already frozen the financial instruments that support them, he'll give you everything you need to know about the Decker outfit's next position in under 5 minutes. You won't have to raise your voice." A silence that lasted about 4 seconds. "Do it," Thane said from the chair. Orson gave Linden one more long look, the kind that was visibly revising something. Then he took the folder and left. She was right about Garrett. It took 4 minutes. The Decker outfit had a secondary staging point 40 miles north, a cold storage facility outside Monroe, 12 men waiting for confirmation that the compound's leadership had been neutralized. Orson's team moved within the hour. The radio updates came in clipped and efficient, and Linden sat in the reading chair across from Thane and listened to the operation resolve itself in real time. Eating the sandwich, Greta had brought up without comment, because she had learned in the past 3 days that Greta communicated primarily through food and silence, and it was actually a very effective system. When the final transmission came through, Monroe secured, Decker operation dismantled. She set down the radio and looked at the gorge window. The river was catching the early morning light in long gold strips between the firs. "You can leave," Thane said. She turned. He was watching her from the chair, his color better than it had been 6 hours ago, the fever visibly broken. He looked stripped down, the way people looked when exhaustion had finally consumed everything they used to perform composure. "The compound is secure," he said. "Orson will take you wherever you need to go. I'll wire payment, the audit, the documentation, everything you did here, whatever number you give me." A pause. "You should go before this becomes something you can't walk back from." Linden looked at him for a long moment. "I already can't," she said. He didn't look away, "because of what you know. Because of what I built." She stood, walked to the desk, picked up the document she'd printed at 4 a.m. while he slept, the restructuring summary, 12 pages, dense and specific, and placed it in front of him. "You have 9 subsidiaries running overlapping freight routes that create a 14% efficiency loss before anyone skims a dollar. Your offshore architecture is solid, but your domestic shell structure flags in a standard IRS cross-reference. 3 entities share a registered agent, and your Tier 2 logistics coordinators have operated without meaningful financial oversight for 4 years, which is exactly how Garrett happened." She sat on the edge of the desk. "I can fix all of it. I can build you a financial structure that doesn't leak, doesn't flag, and doesn't depend on trusting people you shouldn't. And I can do it in 3 months." Thane picked up the summary, read the first page slowly, turned to the second. "You want to stay," he said. "I want to work," she said. "I've spent 10 years handing analyses to men who put their names on them. I'm done with that." She held his gaze without softening it. "I know where every dollar in your operation goes. I know which accounts are real and which are paper. I built your entire evidentiary case in 3 days in a room you locked from the outside. So yes, I want to stay, and I want my name on what I build." The morning was fully in the room now, coming through the arched window over the gorge, falling across the desk and the scattered ledgers and the 12 pages of restructuring analysis he was still holding. "The room wasn't locked from the outside," Thane said slowly. "Not by the end." "No," she agreed, "it wasn't." He set the document down and stood up. Slowly, carefully, one hand braced on the chair arm. He was still moving like someone being mindful of fresh stitches. But he crossed the room and stopped in front of her close enough that she could see the old scar along his jaw clearly, and the new exhaustion sitting in the lines beside his eyes, and the thing underneath both of those that he'd stopped trying to keep off his face. He picked up the summary from the desk. "Read the final page." "This is 6 months of work," he said. "Give me full server access and I'll do it in 3. Something in him shifted. Not the armor coming down. He'd already lost that somewhere around the 4th stitch, when he'd stopped pretending the pain wasn't happening. This was different. This was the specific gravity of a man deciding that the math had finally changed. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face, a small, careful motion, like handling something he didn't want to get wrong. "Partners," he said, "not an offer. The way you'd read a term in a contract aloud to hear how it landed." "Partners," she said. Outside, the Skycomish River ran gold in the morning light, and somewhere in the compound below, Orson's men were finishing the work of dismantling everything that had tried to bring the organization down from the inside. The filing cabinets were reorganized. The forensic trail was documented. The shell accounts were already half rebuilt in her head, cleaner and smarter than anything Garrett or Reiser had ever thought to touch. She had come here to audit his books. She stayed because the ledger was finally hers to write. The deadliest thing about Linden Keane was never the evidence she gathered. It was the fact that she knew exactly what everything was worth, and she had finally stopped discounting herself.